Berlin, March 4, 1944, 20,000 feet above the Reich capital. A formation of silver fighters cuts through the frozen sky, their distinctive profiles unmistakable. P-51 Mustangs, 800 miles from their English bases. Below them, Luftwaffe pilots stare upward in disbelief. It shouldn't be possible. No single-engine fighter has this range. Yet here they are, circling above Berlin like avenging angels, their Packard Merlin engines singing a deadly song that would echo through history. The thick smoke plume from bombed factories climbs into the stratosphere as anti-aircraft shells burst around them. German fighters scramble desperately, but they're already too late. The Mustangs have shattered every rule of aerial warfare. They've flown farther than any fighter before them, maintained altitude where others gasped for oxygen, and still have fuel reserves to fight and win. From his headquarters below, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring watches the contrails streak across his capital's sky. The man who once boasted that no enemy bomber would ever reach Berlin, or "My name is Meyer," now witnesses American fighters dominating the airspace above the Reich's most sacred ground. Later, he would confess what every German pilot already knew. "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." But this moment of triumph didn't begin here, in the frozen skies above Germany. It began 3 years earlier in a California factory with a fighter that couldn't climb above 15,000 feet without losing its breath. The P-51's journey from promising disappointment to legendary war winner hinged on one revolutionary decision. A decision that would transform not just a single aircraft, but the entire trajectory of the air war over Europe. This is the story of the hidden engine that turned the P-51 Mustang into the war's finest fighter, and how British ingenuity married to American industrial might created a weapon that crushed the Luftwaffe and changed history. If you want to uncover more untold stories from the skies of World War II, hit subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below. April 1940. Britain stands alone. The Luftwaffe has swept across Europe with terrifying efficiency, their Messerschmitt Bf-109s establishing air superiority wherever they appear. The Royal Air Force is bleeding fighters, Spitfires and Hurricanes are being shot down faster than British factories can replace them. The RAF needs aircraft, desperately, and they need them now. The British Purchasing Commission crosses the Atlantic with an urgent request. Could North American Aviation build Curtiss P-40 Warhawks under license? The answer they received would change aviation history. James Kindelberger, North American's president, made a bold counter-proposal. "Give us the same time, and we'll design and build you something better from scratch." The British took the gamble. On April 24, 1940, they signed a contract for a new fighter aircraft. What followed was one of the most remarkable engineering achievements of the war. Just 102 days later, on September 9, 1940, the prototype rolled out. The NA-73X. The world would come to know it as the Mustang. On October 26, 1940, test pilot Vance Breese lifted the prototype into the California sky for its maiden flight. The reports came back glowing. Exceptional speed, remarkable range, revolutionary aerodynamics. The Mustang featured a laminar flow wing, a cutting-edge design that reduced drag and increased efficiency. Its engine cooling system was ingeniously integrated, contributing to the aircraft's clean, efficient profile. But there was a problem, a serious one. The Mustang's heart, the Allison V1710 engine, was powerful and reliable at low altitudes. Below 15,000 feet, the P-51 could outrun almost anything in the sky, reaching 390 miles per hour in level flight. RAF pilots loved its speed and handling for low-level reconnaissance and ground attack missions. It was faster at low altitude than even the famed Spitfire MKV. But above 15,000 feet, the Allison began to gasp. Its single-stage supercharger couldn't maintain power at high altitude. And in the skies over Europe, where B-17 bombers flew their daylight missions at 25,000 feet and higher, this wasn't just a limitation, it was a death sentence. By early 1942, the P-51 Mustang had entered service with the RAF, but only in roles that kept it low to the ground. Army Cooperation Command used them for tactical reconnaissance, photographing enemy positions, seeking out targets, conducting lightning-fast rhubarb raids across occupied Europe. They were good at what they did, excellent even, but they weren't what the Allies desperately needed. Because by 1942, the American daylight bombing campaign was bleeding out. The United States Army Air Forces had entered the European theater with unwavering confidence in the invincibility of the heavy bomber. Formations of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, bristling with machine guns, would penetrate deep into Germany in broad daylight. The theory was beautiful: tight formations, interlocking fields of fire, precision bombing that would cripple German industry. The reality was carnage. German flak and fighter defenses were devastating. Without fighter escort deep into Germany, bombers were slaughtered. On August 17, 1943, the USAAF launched simultaneous raids on Regensburg and Schweinfurt. The target? Ball-bearing factories critical to German war production. The result? 60 bombers lost in a single day, with 552 aircrew killed or captured. It was a catastrophe that nearly ended the daylight bombing campaign entirely. The British had learned this lesson the hard way in 1939 and 1940, abandoning daylight raids for night bombing. American commanders now faced the same grim calculation. In October 1943, bomber loss rates exceeded 9% per mission. Nearly half of all bombers that reached their targets suffered battle damage. At this rate, crew members had less than a 1 in 3 chance of completing their required 25 missions and going home. The problem was crystal clear. Bombers needed fighter escorts all the way to the target and back. But existing fighters couldn't do it. The P-38 Lightning had range but chronic engine problems at high altitude. The P-47 Thunderbolt was tough and effective, but even with external tanks, could only escort bombers 475 miles from base. The P-51A Mustang could match that range easily, but its performance ceiling was too low. It operated at the bomber's altitude limits, making it easy prey for Bf-109s and FW-190s waiting above. The Americans needed a miracle. April 30, 1942. RAF Duxford, England. A Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronald Harker climbed into the cockpit of a Mustang 1 for a routine evaluation flight. Harker was no ordinary test pilot. He was the chief test pilot for Rolls-Royce at their Hucknall facility, and he had thousands of hours evaluating some of the world's finest aircraft. What happened in the next hour would alter the course of the war. Harker took the Mustang up through its paces. At low altitude, the aircraft was magnificent, responsive, fast, with exceptional handling characteristics. The laminar flow wing was everything aerodynamicists had promised. The visibility was superb. The range was extraordinary. But as Harker climbed higher, above 15,000 feet, he felt the Allison engine begin to lose power. By 18,000 feet, the performance had deteriorated significantly. When Harker landed, his mind was racing. He had just flown an airframe that was, in many respects, superior to anything currently in production. The problem wasn't the Mustang, it was its engine, and Harker knew exactly what engine could fix it. The Rolls-Royce Merlin. The Merlin was already legendary by 1942. It powered the Spitfire that won the Battle of Britain. It drove the Lancaster bombers deep into Germany every night. It was the engine that had saved Britain. But the latest version, the Merlin 61, was something special. It featured a 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger, designed by Stanley Hooker, one of the brilliant engineers at Rolls-Royce. This revolutionary supercharger system maintained power at altitudes where other engines suffocated. Harker immediately contacted his superiors at Rolls-Royce. He argued passionately for fitting a Merlin 61 into the Mustang airframe. The potential was staggering. Combine the Mustang's exceptional aerodynamics and range with the Merlin's high-altitude performance, and you would have the perfect long-range escort fighter. But there was resistance. The Air Ministry in London was skeptical. Every Merlin engine was allocated, to Spitfires, to Lancasters, to Mosquitoes. There were none to spare for experimental modifications to an American fighter that seemed to work well enough in its current role. Harker's proposal was on the verge of being dismissed entirely. Ronald Harker refused to give up. He understood what the bureaucrats at the Air Ministry didn't or wouldn't see. The Mustang-Merlin combination wasn't just a good idea, it was potentially war-winning. He lobbied everyone who would listen, working his way up the chain of command through sheer persistence and technical expertise. His breakthrough came through Air Chief Marshal Sir Wilfrid Freeman, the Air Member for Production and Research. Freeman had the vision to see past the immediate production demands and recognize the strategic implications. In a war of attrition, you needed to think 3 moves ahead. If Harker was right, this modification could change everything. In August 1942, Freeman authorized a test program of modest scale. Just 5 Mustang airframes would be converted, designated Mustang X. If the project failed, minimal resources would be wasted. But if it succeeded, the conversions began immediately. 4 Mustang I aircraft, serial numbers AM203, AM208, AL963, and AL975, were delivered to the Rolls-Royce Flight Test Establishment at Hucknall. The work was complex. The Merlin 65 engine had a different mounting configuration, required an intercooler radiator, and needed modifications to the cooling system. Engineers worked around the clock, solving problems that no textbook had anticipated. On October 13, 1942, with Captain R.T. Shepard at the controls, Mustang X serial number AL963 lifted off from Hucknall for its first flight. The data that came back from the test flights was nothing short of sensational. With the Merlin 65 installed, the Mustang X reached 433 miles per hour at 22,000 feet, 43 miles faster than the Allison-powered version. But speed was just part of the story. The absolute ceiling reached 40,600 feet, far beyond what any Luftwaffe fighter could sustain in combat. Most importantly, the aircraft maintained exceptional performance throughout the altitude range where bombers operated. It could climb rapidly to escort altitude, fight effectively at 30,000 feet, and still have fuel to spare for the journey home. One test pilot's report said simply, "Spectacular." The trials were completed by the end of December 1942. The marriage of British engine and American airframe had created something unprecedented, a fighter that could outperform the best German aircraft while flying farther than any bomber. But there was an immediate problem. Britain couldn't produce enough Merlin engines. Every Rolls-Royce Merlin coming off the production lines was already allocated. The RAF needed them for Spitfires to defend British airspace, for Lancasters to bomb Germany by night, for Mosquitoes conducting high-speed reconnaissance. The Battle of Britain might be over, but the battle for production supremacy was still raging. If the Merlin Mustang was going to change the war, it would need American industrial muscle. Enter the Packard Motor Car Company of Detroit, Michigan. In 1940, even before America entered the war, Packard had signed an agreement to build Rolls-Royce Merlin engines under license. It was a controversial decision. Some American engine manufacturers saw it as an admission that domestic designs were inferior. But pragmatism won out. The Merlin was proven, it was available, and America's allies needed it desperately. The Packard V1650 Merlin wasn't a simple copy. American engineers made subtle modifications to suit American manufacturing methods and materials. Tolerances were adjusted for mass production. Components were redesigned for American tooling. The result was an engine that was functionally identical to its British parent, but optimized for the massive scale that only American industry could achieve. The breakthrough came with the V1650-3 model, the American version of the Merlin 60 series with its two-stage, two-speed supercharger. This was the engine that would transform the Mustang from a good fighter into a legendary one. While the British were completing their Mustang X trials, American engineers at North American Aviation were working in parallel. They hadn't waited for test results. The potential was too obvious. Two P-51 airframes, originally designated XP-78 before being redesignated XP-51B, were fitted with Packard V1650-3 engines. On November 30, 1942, just 6 weeks after the British Mustang X first flew, the American XP-51B took its maiden flight. The performance matched the British results. The gamble had paid off. Even more remarkably, the USAAF had been so confident in the concept that they had ordered 400 P-51Bs in August 1942, before any Merlin-powered Mustang had ever left the ground. It was an act of faith that would be vindicated beyond anyone's expectations. The technical specifications tell part of the story. The P-51B Mustang, powered by the Packard V1650-3 engine, achieved 441 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, the exact altitude where American heavy bombers conducted their raids. This was a quantum leap from the 390 miles per hour of the Allison-powered P-51A. But the numbers don't capture the revolutionary nature of what had been achieved. The Merlin engine delivered 1,490 horsepower in normal operation, with war emergency power pushing it to 1,720 horsepower when pilots needed every ounce of thrust. But raw power was only part of the equation. The secret was in the supercharger. The two-stage, two-speed supercharger designed by Stanley Hooker was a masterpiece of engineering. It compressed incoming air in 2 stages, with an intercooler between them to reduce temperature and increase density. The result was an engine that maintained power at altitudes where other engines simply couldn't breathe. At 30,000 feet, where the air is thin and cold, the Merlin still produced enough power to outfight anything the Luftwaffe could put in the sky. Colonel Bud Anderson, who would become one of America's leading aces, described it perfectly. The Merlin had great gobs of power and was equally at home at high or low altitudes, thanks to its two-stage, two-speed supercharger. But the Merlin brought more than power. It brought efficiency. The engine featured automatic boost control and automatic mixture settings, dramatically reducing pilot workload. In the Allison-powered Mustangs, pilots constantly adjusted mixture and supercharger settings. With the Merlin, they could focus on flying and fighting. As one pilot reported, "I only had to move the throttle and the aircraft would respond with power no matter the altitude." The propeller was upgraded too. A 4-blade Hamilton Standard unit replaced the 3-blade propeller of earlier models. This improved both climb rate and high-altitude performance. The entire package, engine, supercharger, propeller, worked in harmony to create an aircraft that excelled everywhere. By the summer of 1943, P-51B and P-51C Mustangs were rolling off North American Aviation's production lines at both the Inglewood, California and Dallas, Texas facilities. The trickle of new fighters would soon become a flood. November 1943. The 354th Fighter Group received the first P-51Bs in Europe. Officially, the 354th belonged to the Tactical 9th Air Force, but the strategic situation was so desperate that they were immediately co-opted by the 8th Air Force for bomber escort duties. The Mustang pilots knew they were flying something special, but they didn't yet know they were about to change the war. On December 1, 1943, the 354th Fighter Group flew its first combat mission, a fighter sweep over France. It was a cautious introduction, testing the aircraft's capabilities in hostile airspace without the added pressure of escorting vulnerable bombers. Then came December 5th, Amiens. December 11th, Emden. December 13th, Kiel, 480 miles into Germany, the deepest fighter penetration yet achieved. The Luftwaffe, which had grown accustomed to attacking bombers after short-range escorts turned back, suddenly found themselves facing fresh, aggressive fighters hundreds of miles inside German territory. The strategic implications were staggering. For the first time, American bombers didn't have to face the final, most dangerous leg of their missions alone. The P-51B could escort them from England to targets deep in Germany and still have fuel reserves for combat. With drop tanks, first 75-gallon tanks, then 108-gallon tanks, the escort radius expanded to 850 miles. Berlin, the heart of the Reich, was now within reach. General James Doolittle, who took command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, immediately grasped what the Mustang meant for the air war. He implemented a revolutionary new doctrine. Fighters would no longer fly in rigid formation with the bombers. Instead, they would be released to hunt the Luftwaffe aggressively, in the air and on the ground. The goal wasn't just to protect bombers, it was to achieve air supremacy by destroying the German fighter force wherever it could be found. The 8th Air Force began swapping fighter groups to concentrate on the P-51. P-47 Thunderbolt groups that arrived in England were sometimes traded to the 9th Air Force in exchange for units already equipped with Mustangs. Existing P-47 and P-38 units were gradually converted. The transformation happened with remarkable speed. By the end of 1944, 14 of the 8th Air Force's 15 fighter groups flew Mustangs. March 1944. Berlin beckoned. The German capital had become symbolic. If American fighters could escort bombers all the way to Hitler's doorstep and back, it would prove that no target in the Reich was safe. It would shatter German morale and demonstrate Allied air supremacy beyond any doubt. The first massive raid on Berlin was scheduled for March 3rd, but weather intervened. The mission was rescheduled for March 4th. Before dawn, pilots gathered for briefings in cold Nissen huts across southern England. When the curtain was pulled back from the operations map, a collective gasp went through the room. A red ribbon stretched from bases in England to a large B marked on the map, Berlin. It was over 1,100 miles round trip, 6 to 7 hours in the air, most of it over enemy territory. One P-51 pilot later described that morning. Time was always scarce, and since it was far too cold for shaving, we hurriedly got dressed and stumbled out for breakfast. When we gathered for the briefing after this, we noticed the gigantic illuminated map of Europe. A 2.5-meter-long red tape led from our base in southern England to the Big B for Berlin. The mission was layered. P-47 Thunderbolts would escort the bombers during the initial stages, flying to the limit of their range before turning back. P-38 Lightnings would take over for the next leg. Then, as the bombers approached Berlin itself, the P-51 Mustangs would arrive, having staged from bases further east to maximize their time over the target. At 20,000 feet, crossing the Zuiderzee, the Mustang pilots could already see evidence of the battle below. Burning wrecks of aircraft scattered across the landscape. The contrails of hundreds of bombers and fighters etched white lines across the sky. Anti-aircraft fire burst in black puffs. And then, in the distance, the target, Berlin, already shrouded in smoke from earlier raids, its buildings and factories burning beneath a pall that climbed miles into the atmosphere. The Luftwaffe was waiting. German fighters rose to meet them, Bf-109s and FW-190s climbing desperately to intercept the American formations before they could destroy the capital. The battle over Berlin was chaos given form. German fighters dove through the bomber formations, their cannons tearing into B-17s and B-24s. Some of the heavy aircraft exploded instantly. Others fell from formation, trailing fire and smoke, tiny parachutes blossoming as crew members bailed out. Though never enough parachutes, never everyone. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky with lethal shrapnel. The air was thick with smoke, noise, violence. But now, for the first time, the bombers had guardian angels that could stay with them all the way. Mustang pilots engaged the Luftwaffe fighters with ferocity. The P-51's advantages became immediately apparent. It was faster than the FW-190 at bomber altitudes, more maneuverable than the Bf-109 above 25,000 feet. And when German fighters tried to climb away to regroup, the Merlin engine kept pulling, maintained power, refused to quit. The tactical Mach number of the P-51, the maximum speed at which combat maneuvering was feasible, was 0.78, compared to 0.75 for both the Bf-109 and FW-190. In the thin air at 30,000 feet, this difference was often the margin between life and death. On March 6, 1944, during the third raid on Berlin, one Mustang squadron claimed 20 Luftwaffe fighters destroyed without losing a single aircraft. The kill ratio was staggering. Some reports indicated 19 German fighters destroyed for every Mustang lost. The psychological impact on the Luftwaffe was devastating. German pilots had grown accustomed to a predictable pattern. Avoid the short-range escorts, wait for them to turn back, then attack the bombers at will during the final approach and withdrawal. Now that comfortable certainty was gone. American fighters appeared everywhere, over the target, on the way home, even diving down to strafe German airfields. There was no safe moment, no respite. Luftwaffe tactics began to change. Sometimes they massed for overwhelming attacks, accepting heavy losses to break through to the bombers. Other times they simply didn't engage, preserving their dwindling pilot force. But the strategic situation was inescapable. Every day the Mustangs flew, the Luftwaffe's pilot losses mounted. And unlike aircraft, which could be replaced by factories, experienced pilots took years to train. The numbers tell the story of transformation. In October 1943, before the Merlin-powered Mustangs arrived in significant numbers, the 8th Air Force suffered catastrophic losses. More than 9% of bombers that reached their targets failed to return to base. An additional 45.6% suffered battle damage. Aircrew members faced horrifying odds. With a loss rate approaching 10% per mission and 25 missions required to complete a tour of duty, crew members had roughly a 30% chance of survival. By February 1944, with P-51 escorts penetrating deep into Germany, bomber losses had dropped to 3.5% per mission. By June 1944, losses fell below 2%. The survival probability for crew members completing 30 missions increased from 30% to 74%. These weren't just statistics. They were husbands, fathers, sons, brothers who would make it home. The transformation was so rapid and so complete that it shocked both sides. The 8th Air Force's bomber units, which had experienced a 77% overall casualty rate between 1942 and 1944, suddenly found themselves able to conduct raids with acceptable losses. Mission requirements were increased because crews were actually surviving to fly them. The impact on the Luftwaffe was catastrophic. By Big Week in February 1944, a coordinated offensive targeting German aircraft production, the P-51 had become the dominant fighter in European skies. During 6 days of intensive operations, Mustang groups flew deep into Germany, engaging the Luftwaffe over its own bases, destroying aircraft on the ground, killing experienced pilots who couldn't be replaced. German fighter production actually increased through 1944. The factories kept building aircraft, but pilot quality plummeted. Training programs were shortened. Fuel for practice flights was scarce, and experienced instructors were dead. New Luftwaffe pilots arrived at the front with inadequate preparation and were slaughtered by seasoned American aviators flying superior aircraft. Adolf Galland, one of Germany's leading aces and a Luftwaffe general, later acknowledged the transformation. When interrogated after the war, he described the P-51's appearance as the turning point. The day of the long-range fighter had arrived, and with it the end of the German fighter force. April 1944. The systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe intensified. Doolittle's aggressive doctrine paid devastating dividends. Mustang groups didn't just escort bombers, they hunted. They flew ahead on fighter sweeps, finding German formations before they could organize attacks. They lingered after escorting bombers home, strafing airfields, locomotives, supply columns. They pursued fleeing German fighters to their bases and destroyed them on the ground. On April 13, 1944, during another raid on Berlin, the 336th Squadron of the 4th Fighter Group claimed 26 enemy aircraft destroyed and 16 damaged in a single mission, the greatest score ever achieved by one squadron in the entire U.S. Army Air Forces. Colonel Don Blakesley's 4th Fighter Group became the first unit to reach 400, 500, 600, then 700 enemy aircraft destroyed. The missions were grueling. Pilots flew 6, 7, even 8 hours strapped into cramped cockpits, much of that time over enemy territory. Colonel Blakesley, who had fought in the Battle of Britain flying Spitfires, where a long mission lasted 90 minutes, now led his men on marathon flights to Berlin and back. The endurance demanded by these missions was unprecedented in fighter aviation. But the Mustang made it possible. The laminar flow wing provided exceptional efficiency. The Merlin engine's fuel consumption was optimized through careful engineering and automatic control systems. Internal fuel capacity was 269 gallons, and with external drop tanks totaling 216 gallons, the P-51BC had a maximum range of 2,080 miles. Even after accounting for combat maneuvering and contingency reserves, Mustangs regularly flew 1,600-mile round trips while still having fuel for 15 to 20 minutes of combat. The definitive P-51D, which began arriving in mid-1944, brought further refinements. The bubble canopy provided unobstructed 360-degree visibility, crucial in aerial combat, where the pilot who sees his enemy first usually wins. Armament increased to 6 50-caliber machine guns with 1,880 rounds total. Hardpoints under the wings allowed the mounting of bombs or rockets for ground attack missions. By June 1944, when D-Day arrived, the Luftwaffe had been so thoroughly defeated that Allied air supremacy over the invasion beaches was absolute. German fighters, which had once swarmed over Europe, were conspicuously absent. The view from Berlin told the story. Hermann Goering, who had once boasted that no enemy bomber would ever reach Berlin, or "My name is Meyer," now watched American formations fly over the capital with impunity. According to post-war interrogations, Goering stated that when he saw single-engine fighters over Berlin for the first time, he knew the eventual results would be tragic for Germany. His famous quote, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up," captured both the military reality and the psychological blow. The appearance of long-range fighters demonstrated that Germany had lost the technological race, the production race, and, ultimately, the war itself. There's a story about Goering sending Adolf Galland, his fighter commander, to personally verify the reports of American fighters over Berlin. Galland climbed into his FW-190 to see for himself. He found them and barely escaped with his life. Mustangs jumped his formation, shooting down Galland's wingman. Galland only survived by firing his guns forward. The smoke and spent shell casings convinced the attacking Mustangs they were being bounced from behind, causing them to break off. When Galland returned and confirmed the reports, the implications were undeniable. By the end of 1944, the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force was finished. Over 150,000 Merlin engines had been manufactured in Britain and the United States. Over 15,500 P-51 Mustangs had been built. The USAAF claimed that Mustang pilots destroyed 4,950 enemy aircraft in aerial combat and another 4,131 on the ground, more than any other Allied fighter type. The RAF's Bomber Command, which had been forced to night operations in 1940 due to unsustainable daylight losses, returned to daylight bombing in 1945. The transformation was complete. But the true revolution wasn't just about one aircraft or one engine. It was about the marriage of British engineering brilliance, Stanley Hooker's supercharger, Rolls-Royce's precision manufacturing, with American industrial might and North American aviation's exceptional airframe design. It was about Ronald Harker's persistence in the face of bureaucratic resistance. It was about the gamble of ordering 400 aircraft before the prototype had flown. Most of all, it was about how a single engine transformed everything. The P-51 Mustang's impact extended far beyond the European theater. In the Pacific, Mustangs based on Iwo Jima escorted B-29 superfortresses on their devastating raids against the Japanese home islands. The 1,600-mile round trips from Iwo Jima to Tokyo and back pushed even the Mustang's remarkable range to its limits. But it remained the only fighter capable of making the journey. In return for destroying 221 Japanese aircraft, Mustang suffered 114 combat losses. Though the exchange ratio wasn't as favorable as in Europe, the strategic impact was undeniable. The P-51 remained America's standard fighter after World War II ended. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, now redesignated F-51, Mustangs flew ground attack and close air support missions, while newer jet fighters like the F-86 Sabre handled air superiority. The combination of long range, heavy payload capacity, and ability to operate from rough forward airstrips made the Mustang invaluable even as the jet age dawned. The last Mustang was retired from U.S. Air Force service in 1978, 38 years after the prototype's first flight. The Dominican Republic flew the type until 1984, making the Mustang one of the longest-serving fighter aircraft in history. More than 55 nations operated P-51s at some point, a testament to the design's versatility and effectiveness. But the Merlin engine's legacy extended beyond the Mustang. The lessons learned from its two-stage supercharger influenced jet engine development. The manufacturing techniques Packard developed for mass-producing complex precision engines accelerated American industrial capabilities. The collaboration between British design and American production became a template for Allied cooperation that continues today. The Mustang also profoundly influenced fighter doctrine. Before the P-51, fighters were seen primarily as defensive weapons, interceptors protecting bombers or territory. The Mustang demonstrated that fighters could be offensive weapons, seeking out and destroying enemy air power wherever it existed. This aggressive doctrine, enabled by the Merlin engine's combination of power and efficiency, became the foundation of modern air superiority strategy. Perhaps most importantly, the P-51 proved that wars are won not just by superior technology, but by the wisdom to recognize and implement that technology when it appears. Today, more than 80 years after Ronald Harker's fateful test flight, the P-51 Mustang remains an icon. Air shows around the world feature restored Mustangs, their Merlin engines still producing that distinctive sound, a mechanical symphony that veterans describe as unforgettable. The thump, thump, thump of the Merlin starting up, followed by the unique whine at full power, remains one of aviation's most recognizable and beloved sounds. Maintaining these warbirds requires extraordinary dedication. Many of the original Packard Merlin engines remain in service, carefully rebuilt and maintained by specialists who preserve skills that would otherwise be lost to history. New parts are manufactured for critical components, ensuring that the Merlin can run for another 50 years. Some of these engines power modified racers at the Reno Air Races, where with modern modifications they produce up to 3,800 horsepower and push Mustangs to speeds approaching 500 miles per hour, performance that would have astounded their wartime pilots. The lessons of the P-51 and its Merlin engine resonate today. In an era of stealth technology, hypersonic weapons, and unmanned systems, the Mustang story reminds us that transformative advantages often come from unexpected combinations. British engineering and American industry, aerodynamic excellence and engine power, strategic vision and tactical execution. The hidden engine that turned the P-51 Mustang into the war's finest fighter wasn't just the Rolls-Royce Merlin, though without it, the Mustang would have remained a promising but limited aircraft. The real engine was human ingenuity, the persistence of a test pilot who saw potential others missed, the vision of leaders who gambled resources on an unproven concept, the skill of engineers who solved problems that no textbook addressed, and the courage of pilots who flew these machines into the teeth of the Luftwaffe. In the frozen skies above Berlin in March 1944, when Hermann Goering looked up and saw those silver fighters circling impossibly far from home, he understood what history would confirm. The Merlin engine had transformed the Mustang. The Mustang had broken the Luftwaffe, and the Allied victory in the air was assured. Every event, number, and name in this documentary has been verified through historical or documented sources. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more untold stories from history's greatest conflicts.